I stopped in Callow Bend because my gas gauge was lying to me again, and the town felt like something left behind by a tide that never came back. One main road, a hardware store with a sun-bleached sign, a diner where the coffee tasted like warm iron. I sat at the counter and asked the woman refilling my cup about the painted stones. I had seen them on the drive-in, lining both shoulders of the road for nearly a mile. Smooth river stones, each marked with a careful red spiral. She set the coffee pot down and looked past me at the window. She said they had always been there. I asked who painted them, and she walked to the other end of the counter. The man on the stool beside me was older, wearing canvas work clothes the color of old wheat. He stared at his plate. He said quietly, without turning, that people here did not move them. He said I should not move them either. I paid and walked back out into the flat, gray afternoon. The stones continued farther than I had first thought, curving with the road until they disappeared around a long bend to the south. Some were freshly painted. The red was not quite dry on several of them, bright against the pale gravel, though I had seen no one on that road since morning. I drove north. In my mirror, the town shrank and then was gone, but the stones kept appearing along the roadside for another 2 miles past the last building, then stopped all at once at a culvert over a dry creek bed. I did not get out to look at that final stone. I have thought about it many nights since then, wondering what the spiral on it was meant to face. Our next story. There was a town I passed through once, somewhere in the middle of a long drive I had been putting off for months. I had stopped for coffee and ended up staying 2 nights, though I still cannot fully explain why. The town was called Marin, and it sat in a shallow valley between 2 low hills that blocked most of the afternoon light. The streets were quiet in the way that felt deliberate, not peaceful. Shops were open, people moved about their business, but no one lingered. No one sat on a bench or leaned in a doorway to watch the clouds. On my first evening, I noticed that every house on the main road had its porch light on, even before dusk. I asked the woman at the motel about it. Something casual, just making conversation. She smiled and refilled my coffee and changed the subject so smoothly I almost missed that she had done it. The second morning, I walked toward the far end of town where the road curved behind the eastern hill. There was a small church there, older than the rest of the buildings, and beside it a narrow field of tall grass. The grass had been pressed flat in a wide circle, as if something enormous had rested there and then was gone. The edges of the circle were clean and precise. I stood at the fence for a long time. No one passed behind me, though I had the feeling of being watched from somewhere I could not locate. That afternoon I paid for my room and left without eating. The road out of the valley climbed slowly, and in my rearview mirror, I watched the town disappear below the tree line. Every porch light was still on, pale and small against the gathering afternoon. I have never looked Marin up on a map. Our next story. I found Marrow Creek by accident, the way you find most things that stay with you. My phone had lost signal somewhere past the second ridge, and the road had narrowed down to a single lane of cracked pavement lined with very old pines. By the time the town appeared, the afternoon light had already gone thin and gray. It was a small place. A hardware store, a diner, a post office with peeling paint. Maybe 200 people, if that. I pulled into the diner because I was cold and had been driving since morning, and the warmth inside felt like something earned. The woman who brought my coffee was friendly enough in the way people are when they are being careful. I noticed after a while that no one in that diner faced a window that looked east. Every stool at the counter was turned slightly, every booth angled away. I thought at first it was the light. Then I looked out that eastern window myself. There was a hill out there, maybe half a mile off. Perfectly ordinary, covered in dry grass, bare at the top. But every building I could see from the window had its back turned to that hill. The church, the school, the houses along the far road, all of them oriented slightly away, like a crowd that had quietly agreed not to look at something. I asked the woman refilling my coffee what was up on that hill. She set the pot down very gently and told me there was nothing up there. Her voice was calm and certain in the way that answers a different question than the one you asked. I left before dark. I'm not sure why that felt important. I only know that driving out, I did not look in my mirror either. Our next story. I drove into Pelham Hollow just before dusk, looking for a motel and finding one without much trouble. The woman at the desk handed me a key and smiled the way people do when they're practiced at seeming warm. Her eyes moved past me when she did it, out toward the parking lot, checking something I could not see. The town was small and quiet in the way that feels chosen rather than natural. The diner on the main road had maybe 4 customers, and all of them sat with their backs to the windows. I ordered coffee and eggs and listened to the silence between conversations, which was thick and careful. There was a road I had noticed coming in, branching off the county highway just before the town sign. It had no markings, and it ran straight into a stand of pale birch trees that swallowed it whole. I mentioned it to the woman who refilled my coffee. I asked where it led. She set the pot down and looked at the counter. She said she did not know, which was not an answer anyone gives about a road they have driven past every single day of their lives. The man 2 stools down shifted slightly. He did not look up. That night, I lay in the motel bed and listened to Pelham Hollow settle around me. Somewhere outside, a dog had started barking and then stopped too quickly, the way sounds do when something interrupts them rather than letting them finish naturally. I left early the next morning before the diner opened, before the woman at the desk came on shift. I took the county highway back out. I did not look at the unmarked road as I passed it. I'm still not entirely sure why. Our next story. The gas station in Undle, Missouri closed at 6, and I arrived at 5:53. The attendant was already flipping the sign when I knocked on the glass, and he let me in without a word, which I thought was kind until I noticed he never once looked at me directly. I paid for my gas and a bottle of water and asked, the way you do in small towns, how long the drive was to the next city. He told me the highway number and the approximate miles and nothing else. And when I asked if there was anywhere to eat nearby, something shifted in his face, just slightly, the way a curtain moves when there is no wind. He said there was a diner on Sutter Road and gave me directions that were precise and correct, but delivered in the tone of someone reading instructions for a task they find distasteful. The diner was warm and mostly empty. A woman refilled my coffee twice without being asked and was perfectly pleasant, but when I mentioned I had noticed the elementary school on the edge of town appeared to have been closed for some time, the windows papered over and the playground equipment rusting quietly in the tall grass, she set the coffee pot down and smiled in a way that did not involve her eyes at all. She said children around here mostly went to the school in Ferris County now and left it at that. I did not ask anything more. I ate my food and drove out of Undle before 8, and I told myself the whole way home that there was nothing strange about any of it, that small towns have their history and their silences and their reasons. I almost believed that. Our next story. I came to Stillwater Notch in early November, following a lead for a freelance piece about abandoned textile mills in the hill country. The town was small enough that the main road became the only road within half a block, and the few storefronts I passed were open but somehow looked closed, their lights burning pale and purposeless behind dusty glass. I found a room above the hardware store, rented from a man named Collier, who handed me a key without asking my name. The room smelled of cedar and something older beneath it, something that reminded me of turned soil after a long rain. What I noticed first was the photographs. Every business on the main road had one mounted near the door, framed in dark wood, each showing the same street I was standing on, taken from the same angle, on what appeared to be the same gray morning. In every photograph, the road was empty except for one figure standing at the far end, facing away, too distant to identify. I asked the woman at the bakery about them, pointing gently at the frame by her register. She set down her cloth and looked at me the way people look at a child who has asked something that should not be asked, patient and tired at once. She said they came with the buildings and left it there. On my second evening, I walked to the end of the road at dusk, where a rusted rail fence met a tree line. I stood there longer than I meant to, watching the light go thin and gray through the bare branches. When I turned back toward town, I noticed a light on in my rented room. I had not left the light on. I stood in the road for a while, in the quiet, and then I walked slowly back toward it. Our next story. The woman at the diner in Fallow Ridge poured my coffee without looking at me, and I noticed she kept her eyes on the window the whole time, watching the street outside like she was waiting for something she hoped would not arrive. I had come to Fallow Ridge because of a photograph, an old one sent to me by my grandmother before she passed, showing a church at the end of a long dirt road with a caption on the back in her careful handwriting that said only where your grandfather waited. I had not known there was anything to find. I had simply followed the feeling. The town was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Shops open, signs in windows, a few cars parked along the main road, but almost no one moving. The people I did see walked quickly with their eyes down, the way you walk when you have already decided not to be spoken to. I asked the woman with the coffee about the church in the photograph. She set the pot down very slowly. She said she did not recognize it. Then she picked up the pot and walked back to the counter without another word. And I watched her back and understood that she recognized it perfectly. That evening, I found the dirt road on my own, following the tree lean south of town until the gravel gave way to packed earth. The church was still standing, barely, its white paint gone gray and peeling in long curling strips. The front door was unlocked. Inside, every pew held a single candle, each one recently burned down to a stub, each one cold. There were no names anywhere. No dates. No indication of what anyone had waited for, or whether waiting had ever been enough. Our next story. I stayed in Ember Falls for 3 nights longer than I planned, mostly because the rain would not stop and the roads out of town ran low and soft along the creek beds. It was a quiet place, the kind that feels handmade, like someone built it carefully and then forgot what they were building it for. The storefronts were clean. The sidewalks were swept. People smiled when I passed them, a particular kind of smile that began and ended at exactly the right moment, like something practiced. On my second evening, I noticed the photographs in the diner where I took my meals. They lined the back wall in dark wooden frames, old black and white portraits of the town, street scenes, storefronts, groups of people gathered for occasions I could not name. The photographs were organized by decade, I think, running from very old to somewhat recent. But there was a gap, a stretch of years somewhere in the middle where the wall held nothing but faint outlines in the paint, pale rectangles where frames had once hung for a long time. I asked the woman who brought my soup about it. She looked at the wall the way you look at something you stopped seeing years ago, and then she looked back at me, and she said the frames had been taken down for cleaning. They were not being cleaned. There was no back room, no storage I could see. I asked the man at the front desk of the motel the same question that evening. He listened very carefully, hands folded on the counter, and then he told me the road south would be passable by morning. He was right. They were. I left before breakfast, and I have not been able to find Ember Falls on any map I have looked at since. Our next story. The mechanic in Voss, Georgia, told me my brake line needed 2 days to fix, and I believe him because I had no reason not to. The town sat in a shallow bowl between low hills, the kind of place that felt like it had been pressed down into the earth over a long time. The streets were clean and quiet. People moved through them the way people move when they're used to being watched. On my first evening, I walked to the only restaurant on the main road and ordered whatever was cheapest. The couple at the table near the window stopped talking when I came in. They started again in a moment, softer than before. There was a road at the north end of town that led nowhere I could see. It went past a church with boards over two of its windows and disappeared into the tree line. Every morning, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud along its edge, and every evening those tracks were gone. The dirt smoothed over, the way a face smooths over when someone asks a question they should not have asked. I asked the mechanic about the road on my second day. He kept his eyes on the brake line and said it did not go anywhere useful. I asked the woman at the register of the small grocery store, and she smiled and handed me my change and said something about the weather coming in. On my last morning, I stood at the window of the room I had rented and looked north. A car I had not seen before was parked at the edge of the road into the trees. No one got in or out of it. It was simply there. By the time I collected my keys, it was gone. I drove south and did not look in the mirror. Our next story. I wandered into Dunwich Spur on a Tuesday in late October, following a county road that had petered out into gravel somewhere past the state line. The town sat low in a shallow valley, ringed by bare poplars that seemed too close together, their pale trunks catching what little afternoon light remained. I found a room above a hardware store. The man who rented it to me smiled the whole time, steady and unchanging, and never once asked my name. The town had a quality I could not immediately place. People moved through it deliberately, the way you move through a room where someone is sleeping. Conversations stopped as I passed, not rudely, just completely, the way a radio cuts out in a tunnel. There was a building on the far end of Spur Street, a low concrete structure with painted over windows and a parking lot full of undisturbed leaves. I asked about it at the diner the second morning. The waitress refilled my coffee and mentioned the weather. The older man at the counter studied his plate. A child in the corner booth looked at me for a long moment, then looked away. I walked past the building each evening. I'm not sure why. The painted windows glowed faintly after dark, a dim and sourceless amber, the way a room looks with a single lamp left burning far inside. On my last night, I heard something I cannot adequately describe. A low tone, almost musical, almost human, drifting up through the floorboards of my room sometime after 2 in the morning. I lay still and listened until it faded. In the morning, I left without breakfast. I have looked for Dunwich Spur on maps several times since then. I have not been able to find it. Our next story. My map showed a road through Hester's Mill, but the road itself seemed uncertain about that. It narrowed past the county line until the trees were close enough to brush the mirrors. And by the time I reached town, I had the feeling I had arrived somewhere that had not quite agreed to be found. I stopped for water at a small store near the center of town. The man behind the counter was friendly enough in the way that people are friendly when they want you to finish quickly and leave. He asked where I was headed. I told him I was just passing through. He nodded slowly, the way you nod at something you do not believe. Outside, I noticed a monument. It stood in a little square across the road, a pale stone marker surrounded by low iron fencing. No names on it that I could read from where I stood, only a date. A single year, carved deep. A woman walking past slowed when she saw me looking at it. Our eyes met, and she moved on without a word, her pace the same measured quiet as everyone else in Hester's Mill. I asked the man in the store about it when I went back for change. I had forgotten. He looked at the window for a moment, then at the counter, then said it was just an old thing. It had always been there. His voice was even and practiced. I drove out of Hester's Mill before the light faded. The road widened again once the trees thinned, and the town disappeared from my mirrors before I expected it to. I looked up that year when I got home. I found nothing. Not because nothing happened, I think, but because Hester's Mill had been very careful for a very long time. Our next story. I first heard about Sable crossing from a clerk at a roadside pharmacy 2 towns over. She mentioned it only once, quietly, while counting out my change, and when I asked her to repeat herself, she looked past me at the window and said she must have been thinking of somewhere else. I found the town anyway, the way you sometimes find things you were never quite looking for. It sat low in a river valley, pressed between two hills that seemed to lean toward each other overhead. The streets were clean and the houses were well kept, and the people moved through their days with a kind of careful, practiced calm that felt less like contentment and more like concentration. I stopped for lunch at a small place near the center of town. The woman who served me was pleasant enough, asking where I had come from, nodding at my answers. But when I mentioned the dry stretch of road leading into town, the one where every tree on both sides had been cut down to the roots and the stumps left pale and level with the earth, she set down my glass and smoothed her apron and said something about the weather. I ate slowly. Through the window, I could see the valley floor, and at its lowest point, there was a shallow depression in the ground, maybe a quarter mile across, perfectly circular, where nothing grew. No grass, no weeds, nothing. Just dark earth sitting quietly in the middle of everything. I paid my bill and drove back through town, and not one person I passed looked up from what they were doing. Not one. They moved with that same careful attention, eyes cast slightly downward, shoulders drawn in, as though they were all listening to something just below the range of hearing. I did not stop again. Our next story. The ferry to Linden Isle ran twice a day, and I had missed the last one by 20 minutes. The woman at the ticket window told me this without looking up, her pen moving slowly across some form I could not read from where I stood. She told me there was a bed and breakfast on the east side of the village, and she gave me directions in a flat, careful voice, and that was all she said to me for the rest of the evening. Linden Isle was small enough that I could walk its two main streets in under an hour. The houses were old and well kept, the gardens still holding the last pale flowers of September. People were out, watering things, carrying groceries, moving between gates and doorways. They noticed me the way small towns always notice strangers, a brief settling of the eyes before they looked away. What I could not understand was the boats. There were dozens of them pulled up along the shore, small wooden ones mostly, all of them painted the same faded blue, all of them with their oars removed and laid in careful rows on the grass beside them. Not stacked, not stored, just laid out flat, evenly spaced like something arranged before a ceremony. I asked the man who ran the bed and breakfast about it over breakfast the next morning. He poured my tea and set the pot down and was quiet for a moment before he said it was just the way things were done here at this time of year. He said it pleasantly with a small smile, and then he asked if I needed anything else, and that was the end of it. The ferry came at 9. I watched the oars from the water as the island grew small behind me, still lying in their rows, and I did not ask anyone else about them. Our next story. My car needed a night's rest before the mountain pass, so I pulled into Grover's Sit, a small town press flat between two ridges like something that had been stepped on and never quite recovered. I found a room above a hardware store, the kind with a radiator that ticked all night and curtains that never fully closed. I noticed a field on my second morning. It sat at the edge of town where the pavement gave way to gravel, about 2 acres of tall grass ringed by a low stone wall. Nothing unusual except that no one walked past it. People in Grover's Sit crossed the street before they reached it, casually, as though they had always meant to go that way. I asked the woman who brought my breakfast what was in the field. She set my plate down and smiled at something just past my shoulder. She said it was nothing, just an old lot. And then she refilled my coffee and never came back to my table. I walked out there alone that afternoon. The grass was very still, even though the air was moving through the rest of town. The stone wall was old, older than anything else nearby, and some of the stones had shallow markings I could not read. I stood at the gap that served as an entrance for a long time. I did not go in. I'm not sure I could explain why. only that something in the quality of the quiet discouraged it. That evening I sat on the steps outside the hardware store and watched the sun go down behind the far ridge. A man walking his dog crossed to the opposite side of the road, without looking up, without slowing, the same as everyone else. I left the next morning, before the town was awake. Our next story. I walked into Verne, Kentucky on foot, which made me unusual from the start. My ankle had turned on a gravel road 2 miles back, and I limped into town just as the afternoon light went the color of old brass. The main street was short enough to see from one end to the other. A hardware store, a post office, a diner with a hand-lettered sign in the window. Inside the diner, it was warm and smelled of coffee and something sweeter underneath, like what left too long in standing water. A man at the counter nodded once when I came in. The woman who brought my water set it down without meeting my eyes. I asked the woman, just making conversation, what the fenced field was at the edge of town, the large empty one with no crops and no animals, only a single wooden post standing in the center. She refilled my coffee without answering. Not rudely, not nervously either, just quietly, the way a person changes the subject by doing something with their hands. I asked the man at the counter instead. He looked at his cup for a moment, then said only that the field had always been there. He said the way you say something is finished, final and soft and not unkind. After I ate, I walked back through town to find somewhere to rest my ankle for the night. I passed the field again in the early dark. The post in the center was closer than it had seemed from the road. I was sure of that. I had not gone near the fence, but there it was, perhaps 10 feet from the wire now, its shadow lying long across the pale grass. I did not look at it again. I found a motel and drew the curtains and lay there listening to the quiet settle around the building like snow. Our next story. The post office in Cinder Wash, Nevada opened at 9 and closed at 9:05, which I only learned because I was sitting in my parked car watching it happen. The woman who locked the door did not look at me, though I was the only other person on the street. She walked back toward the row of identical beige houses at the edge of town and disappeared into the second one from the left. And the street was empty again before I had time to decide whether to call out to her. I had stopped because of a headache and a need for water. The single gas station had water, and the man behind the counter took my $2 without speaking and without meeting my eyes. And when I asked if there was a place to get lunch, he pointed vaguely toward the window. I looked out and saw only the street, the flat, gray buildings, the enormous pale sky pressing down on everything. When I turned back, he had already moved to the far end of the counter and picked up a rag and begun wiping something that did not need wiping. There were wind chimes hanging from every porch, dozens of them, and not one of them moved even when the dust stirred on the road. I noticed that later, sitting in my car, trying to let the headache ease before I drove on. The air felt thick in a way that had nothing to do with heat. A child crossed the street at the far end of town. She stopped in the middle and looked in my direction for a long moment, then walked on. She was too far away to read her expression, but something about the stillness of her made me sit up a little straighter. I left before the headache was gone. Our next story. The bridge into Lock Ferry had been closed for 11 years, which was why I had to drive the long way around, through the back roads that wound between the pines like something avoiding its own reflection. I stopped at a hardware store for directions, and the man behind the counter gave them to me slowly, carefully, the way you give directions to a place you would rather not name. He told me where to turn and where not to, and when I asked why not, he set my change on the counter without putting in my hand. The town itself was small and clean the way that some towns are clean when they're trying very hard to appear ordinary. White paint on every door. Flower boxes that all held the same variety of pale bloom. I noticed the lake almost immediately because the whole town seemed to lean slightly away from it. I ate dinner at the only restaurant and listened to the conversation around me. which covered weather and fuel prices and a high school sporting event it could not quite identify. Nobody mentioned the lake. Nobody sat near the windows that faced it. I slept in a room above the restaurant and woke once in the night to a stillness, so complete it felt less like silence and more like something holding its breath. I lay there listening to nothing until nothing was all there was. In the morning, I walked to the water before breakfast. The dock was old and unused, its boards pale and soft. There were no birds. The surface of the lake was absolutely calm, the color of old pewter, and it reflected the sky so perfectly that I could not find the line where one ended and the other began. I left before noon. I have not found the line since. Our next story. I rented a room in Ashford Crossing for a week while I waited on a delayed inheritance, paperwork that kept not arriving. The town sat low between two ridge lines, the kind of place where morning fog never fully lifted, just thinned to a gray gauze by afternoon. I found the people pleasant enough in the ordinary ways, helpful with directions, quick to smile, but there was a particular subject that made them all go still. There was a field at the edge of town, past the old creamery, where nothing grew. Not dead grass, not weeds, nothing at all. Just dark, smooth earth in a rough circle, maybe 40 feet across. I noticed it on my second day walking, and when I asked the woman who ran the inn about it, she refilled my water glass very carefully and changed the subject to the weather. I asked at the hardware store. The man there suddenly found something urgent to count on the shelf behind him. I asked a retired farmer sitting outside the diner, and he looked at the field in the distance for a long moment before excusing himself without a word. The field bothered me the way a half-remembered dream does, shapeless but insistent. I walked out to it one evening as the light was going amber and thin. The earth inside that circle was softer than the ground around it, warmer too, I thought, when I crouched and pressed my palm flat against it. Not warm like sun-warmed soil, warm like something just beneath. I pulled my hand back and walked to the inn without stopping. The paperwork came the next morning, and I left before noon. I did not say goodbye to anyone. I still think about how none of them ever looked directly at it, only near it, the way you look near something bright. Our next story. The innkeeper in Vessels. Oregon handed me my key without once looking at the calendar on the wall behind her, even though I had asked which day the town held its harvest festival. She just smiled and told me the rooms were quiet this time of year. I had come for the festival. Actually, I had read about it in a travel magazine from 3 years back, a small piece tucked between advertisements, describing lanterns along the waterfront and music from the old pavilion. The writer had seemed charmed by the place, but the pavilion, when I found it the next morning, was boarded shut, though it looked old, gray and soft from years of coastal rain. No recent work. It had been closed for a long time. I asked the man at the hardware store about the festival, and he became very occupied with counting bolts. I asked the woman arranging flowers outside the church, and she said she was new to town and wouldn't know about that sort of thing. She had the careful, practiced tone of someone who had answered that question before. There was a photograph in the window of the diner. A crowd gathered near the water. Lanterns reflected on the surface below them. Everyone was facing away from the camera, which was strange enough. But what I kept returning to was the water itself. How it seemed to hold the light differently than water should. How something beneath the surface gave the lantern's glow a depth and a color that didn't quite belong to fire. I left Vessels on the third morning before the town had properly woken. I never found a travel magazine again. I looked more than once. The issue seemed not to exist anywhere that I could trace. Our next story. I spent 4 days in Grover's Landing because the only mechanic in town had gone quiet on a Tuesday, and nobody seemed to find that strange. I had come in on a Monday, following a county road that narrowed steadily until the trees pressed close on both sides and the gravel turned soft beneath my tires. The town sat at the edge of a wide, still lake, and the water was the color of old pewter in the afternoon light. Nothing moved on it. No boats, no birds, nothing at all. The woman who ran the boarding house gave me a room on the second floor facing the water. She was pleasant enough in the careful way of someone choosing every word slowly, the way you choose footing on a path you do not trust. When I mentioned the lake, she nodded once and changed the subject without appearing to. On Wednesday, I noticed the children did not play near the water. They played in yards and in the dry park at the center of town, and if a ball rolled toward the lakefront street, they waited for an adult to retrieve it. I asked the man at the hardware store about it. He was sorting bolts into small paper bags, and he kept sorting them while I spoke, and then he said it was just the way it was here that the water ran cold and the footing was poor and kids could not be trusted near the edge. That night, I sat by my window and watched the surface of the lake for a long time. There was no wind. The water did not move. But just before I turned away, I thought I saw something underneath it, something pale and slow, passing from left to right without disturbing anything above it at all. I left the next morning before the town was awake. Our next story. The train skipped Aldermore on the official maps, but it stopped there anyway, just for a moment, in the gray hour before dawn. I had fallen asleep somewhere past the last named station and woke to find the car completely still and the platform outside my window lit by a single yellow bulb. I stepped off, not entirely sure why. The air was cold and smelled of pine and something faintly mineral like wet stone. There were no other passengers. The train moved again almost immediately, very quietly, and then I was alone on the platform with a small bag and no real plan. The town was 3 streets wide and arranged around a square with a dry fountain at its center. The fountain had been filled with soil at some point, and someone had planted things in it, though nothing was growing now. The dirt was smooth and undisturbed. People were kind enough. The woman at the hardware store let me use her telephone. The man who ran the only lodging place, a narrow house with guest rooms above a closed gift shop, took my money without comment and gave me a key on a plain ring. Both of them were pleasant in a way that felt practiced, as though they had agreed in advance on exactly how much warmth to offer. I noticed on the second morning that none of the buildings on the north side of the square had windows facing the square. They had walls there, blank and smooth, where windows should have been. I asked about it at breakfast, and the woman who brought my eggs smiled at the table instead of at me and said it had always been that way. That afternoon, I found photographs in a local history book at the library. The windows had been there once. Our next story. The road into Sutter's Vein was unmarked, which should have told me something. I found it by following a river that had no name on my map, and I arrived on a Wednesday morning when the fog was still low against the fields and the light was the color of old paper. The town had a diner, a hardware store, a post office with its flag at half-mast. I did not ask about the flag. Something in the way the woman behind the counter slid my change across without touching my hand made me decide not to ask about anything at first. I noticed the photographs on the second day. They were in the windows of several houses, not inside, but pressed against the glass facing outward, as if someone wanted them seen from the street. They were all of the same field, taken at different times of year, always from the same angle, always empty. No people, just a flat stretch of grass and a line of pale trees at the far edge. I found a field on my third morning there. It was where the photographs said it would be, past the grain elevator and behind a low hill. The grass was dry despite the rain we had been having, and it made a sound underfoot that I could not explain, a sound like something settling just ahead of wherever I stepped. I stood at the edge for a long time. The trees at the far end were still. The sky above them was ordinary. There was nothing wrong that I could point to, nothing I could name or measure. When I mentioned the field to the man at the hardware store, he looked past my shoulder for a moment before saying he was not familiar with it. He knew exactly which field I meant. Our next story. I followed the detour signs into Chalk Hollow on a gray Wednesday afternoon, the kind of afternoon where the light never quite arrives and the clouds sit low and still like something listening. The town was small enough that I could see most of it from the junction. A pharmacy, a diner, a hardware store with a hand-painted sign. A church with its marquee letters rearranged into no particular message. Just loose alphabet scattered behind glass. I went into the diner for coffee and a plate of something warm. The woman behind the counter was pleasant enough, efficient, the kind of pleasant that keeps itself at a careful distance. When I asked about the memorial at the edge of town, the one I had passed on the way in, 30 or 40 wooden markers pressed together in a rough field with no names carved on any of them, she refilled my cup and changed the subject so smoothly I almost missed that she had done it. I asked again at the pharmacy, gentler this time. The pharmacist counted my change twice before answering that he was not the right person to ask. I walked back past the markers before I left. They were weathered but tended, which meant someone was still caring for them. The ground around them was soft despite the dry season, soft in the way of ground that has been turned and turned again over many years. A man in a truck idled at the road beside me for a moment, watching through his window without expression. Then he drove on. I stood there a while longer, counting the markers. I lost count somewhere near the middle and started again and got a different number each time. I left before dark because something about the field made me feel like the polite thing to do was not to still be there when the light changed. Our next story. The rain had been falling for 2 days by the time I reached Dunmore Flats, and the motel on the edge of town was the only place with a light still burning. The woman behind the desk took my cash without comment and slid a key across the counter. And when I asked if there was anywhere still serving food, she pointed down the main road without looking up from her book. The diner was nearly empty. A man in a feed cap sat at the far end of the counter, and a younger couple shared a booth near the window, speaking in voices too low to carry. The waitress brought my coffee and pie without being asked, as if she already knew what I needed, and I thought that was just small-town intuition until I realized no one in the room had looked at me once. I noticed a mural on the wall later, between my second cup and the check. It covered the entire north side of the diner, painted in careful, faded strokes. A town square, people gathered around something in the center, something tall and narrow that the artist had left deliberately indistinct. The crowd in the painting faced away from the viewer. Every single figure facing away. I left a generous tip and walked back in the rain. In the morning, I stopped at the hardware store for a map and asked the man behind the counter what year the town had been founded. He told me he had lived there his whole life and did not know. He said it pleasantly, as if the answer were perfectly reasonable. On the road out, I passed the town square. There was a concrete base in the center, smooth and old, where something had once stood. No plaqué, no explanation, just the base and the rain and the empty space above it. Our next story. The nearest motel to Parlor Creek was a converted Victorian on the edge of town, and the woman who ran it smiled at everything I said except the one question I asked. I had been driving since morning, winding through low hills and pine corridors, and by the time I reached the town, it was already the color of old photographs, all amber and gray. I checked in, left my bag on the narrow bed, and walked the main street to find somewhere to eat. There were 3 restaurants on the block, and only one still had lights on inside. I sat at the counter and ordered soup, and while I ate, I watched a man across the street, standing very still beside a lamppost. He was not waiting for anyone. He was simply standing there, looking at the ground, the way a person looks when they are remembering something they would rather not. I asked the woman refilling my water glass what the church at the end of the road was for. Not which denomination, what it was for. She set the pitcher down and wiped her hands on her apron and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. The church had no windows. I had noticed that when I drove in. A long, low building with smooth white walls and a door that looked recently painted, surrounded by a lawn that was cut perfectly, even though no one in town seemed to talk about who tended it. That night, I lay in the motel bed and listened to the quiet, which was complete and total, the kind of quiet that does not feel like absence, but like presence, like something holding its breath just outside the range of ordinary hearing. In the morning, the man was gone from beside the lamppost. The lawn was freshly cut again. Our next story. I took the long way through Corbin's wake because the interstate was backed up for miles, and something about the detour signs felt hand-painted and recent, like someone had made them just for me. The town sat in a shallow basin between two hills that were somehow too symmetrical, too evenly rounded, as though the land had been shaped by something patient and deliberate. I stopped for water at a small grocery on the main road. The woman behind the counter was kind enough, asking where I was headed, nodding when I told her. But when I mentioned the photograph taped to the community board near the door, a faded image of a crowd gathered around what looked like an empty foundation, she stopped nodding. She said it was nothing, an old thing. She said the way you say a word so many times it loses meaning. I ate at the only diner and noticed the tables near the window were never chosen, even when the room filled. People sat toward the back and kept their voices low, and no one looked out toward the road. I sat by the window and watched the street, and nothing happened, which was somehow worse than if something had. Before I left, I asked the young man refilling my coffee whether anything unusual had ever happened here, phrasing it gently, like I was just curious. He looked at me for a long moment, then looked at the window, then back at his coffee pot. He said that people passed through all the time and asked the same thing. I asked what he told them. He said he told them the same thing he was about to tell me. Then he smiled quietly and walked back to the counter without finishing the sentence. And I drove out of Corbin's wake as the light began to go gray and soft behind me. Our next story. The librarian in Selby Ford, Tennessee, gave me a visitor's map with one street blacked out. And when I asked about it, she just smiled and slid my change across the counter without a word. I had come for the estate sale of a distant relative I had never met, a man named Orrin who had lived alone on the eastern edge of town for most of his adult life. The locals knew him, clearly. When I mentioned his name at the hardware store, the man behind the register found something very interesting to look at on the floor. The house itself was modest and cold, even in the middle of May. Every window faced west, which struck me as strange given how the lot was positioned. There were no mirrors inside, not a single one. I spent 2 days sorting through Orrin's things. He had been a collector of maps, mostly old ones, some hand-drawn. Nearly all of them had the same feature. A section carefully removed, cut cleanly with scissors or a blade, leaving a neat rectangular gap wherever some particular area had been. On my last evening, I walked the town slowly, trying to find a blacked-out street from the visitor's map. I located every other road without difficulty. Marin Avenue, Cross Hollow Lane, the little unnamed path that ran behind the church. But the one in the middle of the map simply did not appear, no matter how many times I reoriented myself by the steeple. I stood at what should have been its entrance and looked at a perfectly ordinary gravel lot beside the post office. A woman walked past with a small child. The child looked at the lot for a long moment, then looked at me. Then she took her mother's hand and did not look back. Our next story. I arrived in Kettlemore by train, the only passenger to step off at that particular stop, and the platform was empty in the way that felt less like quiet and more like held breath. The station agent, a thin man in a gray coat, took my ticket without a word and pointed me toward the main road before disappearing back into his booth and pulling the shade. The town was small and old and arranged too neatly, as though someone had pressed it flat. There was one street of shops, a church with no signage, in a park at the center where a stone monument stood beneath a canvas tarp tied down with rope. I noticed it the first morning because the tarp was clean and clearly tended to not the kind of thing left and forgotten, but the kind of thing deliberately kept covered. I asked the woman at the bakery about it while she counted my change. Her hands went still for just a moment before she resumed counting and told me it was nothing of interest. A local thing. Old. I asked the man at the hardware store, and he looked past my shoulder to the window and said the same words nearly exactly. A local thing. Old. On my second evening, I sat on a bench across from the monument and watched it as the light faded. 3 separate people walked past it without glancing toward it, the way you avoid looking at something you are deeply aware of. That night, I heard footsteps on the street below my window, slow and even circling the park. I did not look out. When I left the next morning, the station agent was already watching from his window. He raised one hand as the train pulled away, and I was not sure whether it was a farewell or a warning. Our next story. The phone signal died 3 miles before I reached Vashton, and it never came back. I had pulled over to check my atlas, the paper kind I kept in the glove box for situations exactly like this. And when I looked up, the town was simply there, settled into the valley below me like it had always been waiting. I needed somewhere to eat and somewhere to rest. Vashon offered both, technically. The diner was warm and smelled of old coffee and something faintly sweet beneath it, like fruit left a day too long. The woman who brought my food was polite in the way that keeps a careful distance. She refilled my water once without being asked and did not return after that. There was a photograph on the wall near the door. A town gathering of some kind, some are by the look of the light, maybe 40 or 50 people arranged in loose rows. What made me set down my fork was the space in the middle of the photograph. Not an empty space exactly, more like a space where something had been carefully removed, and the people on either side of it were angled slightly inward, the way people angle toward a person who is no longer there. I asked the man at the register about it. He looked at the photograph for a moment, then looked at me, then looked at his hands. He said it was an old picture. I slept at the motel on the edge of town and woke twice in the night to the sound of something that might have been wind moving through the trees, except that the trees outside my window were perfectly still. In the morning, I drove out the way I had come. The atlas showed Vashton clearly labeled and measured. It showed nothing in the center of it. Our next story. The road through Hallow wasn't on any map I checked, but the motel owner in the next county over had mentioned it the way people mention things they immediately regret, quietly, with his eyes already moving somewhere else. I found it on a Thursday, in the thin gray light of early afternoon. The town sat low in a shallow valley, the kind of place where fog collects and lingers long past morning. The storefronts were open. People moved along the sidewalks. But when I stopped to ask a woman near the hardware store where I might find something to eat, she pointed wordlessly toward a diner at the end of the block and then walked away before I could thank her. The diner was warm and smelled of coffee and something sweeter underneath, something faintly wrong. I sat at the counter and watched the other customers. No one spoke, not to each other, not to the waitress, not to the old man in the corner booth who kept turning a folded piece of paper over and over in his hands without opening it. I asked the waitress about a road I'd seen on my way in, a gravel track that branched off toward the eastern ridge. She filled my cup slowly and said only that most people stayed off it. I asked why. She smiled, and there was something tired in it, the kind of smile that has been used to close conversations for a very long time. I finished my coffee and walked back to my car. The eastern ridge sat dark against the pale sky, and the gravel road curved up toward it and disappeared into the tree line. I sat there for a long while, watching the ridge, before I finally pulled back onto the main road and drove on. I have thought about that curve in the road many nights since.